Hey there, and welcome to another edition of Inside Intercom. I'm Liam Geraghty. Today, we are revisiting an interview from 2018 with Jean Su. Jean is VP of Engineering at Range, which makes product management software that aims to make teamwork way less work. Before that, she worked at places like Google, Pulse, and Medium. When we spoke to Jean, she was an engineering leadership coach, and she shared her advice on people-centric management, specifically how to bridge the gap between transitioning from an individual contributor to first-time manager. In today's episode, you'll hear Jean talk about leadership voids in the tech climate, whether or not managers still need to allocate time toward keeping their technical skills sharp, and the importance of a psychologically safe work environment. Former Intercom editor Adam Risman was behind the mic for this interview. So let's head over to the studio to hear Adam chat with Jean Su.
Jean, welcome to Inside Intercom.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. So you spent the last while of your career as an engineering leadership coach, which we'll get into what exactly that means here in a minute. But for many years, you worked in-house as a IC and engineering lead at a range of different tech companies. So just to get us started, could you give us the cliff notes of your career to date? I mean, how did you get here?
Sure. I started as an intern at Google, and that was my first and only tech internship, and I converted to full-time. So I ended up moving out here from New Jersey, worked at Google Mountain View for about a year and a half on the checkout team, left with not really any plans other than I want to see what else is out there. And I didn't, from the East Coast, I didn't know what else was out there. And then I did a bit of Android work on my own and then ended up at Pulse, which is a news or RSS reader. And I worked on their Android app for almost exactly 1 year. At that point, I was recruited to the Obvious Corporation, which later became Medium. I worked on the first Medium prototype. That was really where I spent a lot of time as an IC and then tech lead and then eventually engineering manager.
You must have seen Medium change and grow a lot in that time, and you were there for how long?
About 5.5 years.
Wow. Yeah.
So yeah, it was like 5 people on the product team when I joined, and then it was the whole company was, I think, 160 at its peak when I was there.
And so what was it? Was there an aha moment that drove you to then leave Medium and go into coaching, leadership coaching?
I think the end of last year, there were a lot of kind of reflection points. I mean, I just turned 30. So you start to, think about what you're doing with your life. And then it was the end of the year, which is also, a common reflection point.
I turned 30 in 6 months, so I've been thinking about this too much.
Yeah, exactly. It's a very natural time to question, take a critical look. And then I had just hit my 5-year mark too. And so it's kind of like all those 3 things together. I started to think about what was next.
And so in practice, what does the role of an engineering leadership coach look like? Because unless you have a coach, it's hard to envision what coaching is.
Right. Actually, what I do is usually a mix of coaching and mentorship, depending on the client. But coaching by itself is really helping someone figure out what it is they already know. And so that might be helping them get in touch more with what their inner critic says. What are the things that hold them back? And then what is it that they want? Because a lot of people actually don't get asked that a lot. What do you want? And then helping them come up with a plan to get to what they want.
Does everyone have an answer for that right away, though? What do you want?
Yeah, no, because you're not asked. You're basically never asked it directly. So a lot of people don't. And a lot of the coaching is helping them, reflecting back to them what seems to excite them. So I might say something like, oh, when you talked about this project, your face really lit up, and helping them figure out what it is that they get excited about so that they can then figure out what they want.
So is this a void that you felt personally in your own transition into leadership? I mean, take me back to that transition for you. What stories or lessons stick out the most?
Sure. It was, I think what led me to coaching was realizing that it was a pretty rough transition despite all the support I had. So I had, a really supportive manager. I had a lot of peers that I could lean on. And even then, I remember, one of the stories that stick out to me was I wasn't used to, as an IC, your calendar is pretty much open, right? And I remember having switched to management and waking up one morning, looking at my calendar, and I just had like meetings from like 9 to 5.
So when does the work get done?
Yeah. And so like I was definitely in that mindset of like, this is not the real work, right? And I remember rolling out of bed, getting my laptop out and just opening like 3 pull requests to delete like a few hundred lines of code that I had just found like within 10 minutes. And then I was like, oh, phew, well, now I've done some work today. Now I can like go to my meetings. And so that was really one of the moments I remember. And now I'm like, oh, it was clear that I wasn't in the mindset yet that the meetings were actually the work, not just like something that was happening to me and taking up my time. But that's a really rough transition to make because engineers spend so much time working with code, working with software, building systems. And then if they switch to tech lead or manager, then they're really expected to step away from that in some capacity. And that can be a really difficult way of like, how do I deal with my own like self-worth and productivity?
Yeah, how do you measure accomplishments and things like that?
Yeah, because it can take a lot longer for some of the things in management to kind of pan out and give you that feedback.
You mentioned that you felt like you did have pretty good support, but do you feel like that is common in this industry? Or do a lot of the people that you work with tend to not have access to that support that you had?
I don't think it's common. I think Medium had a very unusually people-centric and very supportive culture. And actually, when I first transitioned to management, it was actually this term called group lead. And it was more of a coach, really, because I didn't work with a lot of the people that I was group lead for. And so I came to management very much from this, like, I had to learn how to be a coach because I couldn't just be like, thanks for the feedback, I'll go fix your problem now,
right.
Which you can do if you're kind of like a tech lead manager. You can kind of lean into the, I'll just go fix it for you, or I'll just go do it myself.
But I mean, you have to have some restraint there, right? Or it's going to be hard for people to learn from those mistakes.
Yeah.
Did you feel like, you mentioned having to those pull requests, was it hard for you to step away from the code base?
It was, I think, not as hard as for some people. It was hard to step away because that's something, especially deleting code, was very like therapeutic for me. And so it was kind of this like ongoing joke where people my manager would be like, oh, you seem kind of stressed out lately, because he'd see like, 5 to 10 pull requests of like code deletion. So it was hard to step away, but I think it was, for me, I think I had this realization one day that I was actually, like, it doesn't do anyone good for me to clean up after them.
Right.
It was actually teaching them that like someone is going to clean up after you. And I was kind of depriving them of the joy of doing that because I found it so joyful, and I was really like taking it away.
So in the time since your own transition with a lot of people that you've worked with in the past year, do you feel, whether they're first-time managers or even people who are veterans in that type of role, that where they're struggling is in a lot of those same places, or is that landscape evolved a little bit?
I think it depends on the person, but I definitely see a lot of common themes. I mean, I think for first-time sort of like team lead or tech lead or first-time managers, there's definitely the productivity when you're stepping away from the work of feeling like, oh, I don't want to be too far away from it because then what's my value? But there's also, I think, a common transition of like being the good student, the like person who does the stuff that someone hands to you, but you're not really responsible for the decisions. You just do the stuff. That transition from that to being the responsible party. So the person who sees a problem and comes with a solution and takes initiative and, rallies the troops and like presents it to the executive team and say, hey, we have this problem. Here's how we want to solve it.
Right. And then it can also go back to the team and make sure that everyone feels like they have a role that matters in that equation to ultimately solving that problem, right?
Right. Because it's really easy just to complain
Yes.
and not really be part of the solution.
So Google, Pulse, Medium, not just very different companies, but very different in terms of size and scope. I'm wondering, what's something that maybe you took from the culture of each of those places? Could be positive, could be negative, could just be peculiar or interesting that has really stuck with you and helped shape the way that you advise others?
I think Google really showed me what's necessary at scale. So, I went into Google with no real sense of what it means to be a software engineer. And I came out with a much better sense of that. And so just like code reviews, technical rigor, all that stuff, which is less important at when you're like 2 people. but much more important when it's like, there's 10,000 engineers working on one code base, right? So that really instilled that in me. I didn't know that that was because of the scale until I moved to Pulse. And I realized that, that there were very few tests in the code base. Like there was a lot of copy paste. There was a lot of, even in the same file, like inconsistent indentation. And it was very surprising to me. But I also realized that, they had done something I don't think any team at Google would have been able to do. They shipped an iPhone, iPad, and Android app all within 6 months. So I think for me, that really showed me like when do you just kind of like throw things out and see what sticks,
Right.
and when do you build it? Because Google, you don't get to do that, right? Like anything you ship is going to have millions of users like on day one. So
You can't move quite as fast.
Right. Like there's a level of like, you have to build it right because there's nothing, it might just get deprecated in a year, but you still have to build it to a certain level.
Well, every little change is affecting either the lives or workflows or whatever it may be of so many people that the domino effect is much larger if one little thing goes wrong.
Yeah. Whereas Pulse came from a very like IDEO design school type of like, see what happens, get a lot of user feedback and like iterate, and no one really knows us anyways. So we'll just like try a bunch of things and see what happens.
Ship to learn, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Move quickly.
And what about at Medium?
Medium, I think, is where I really saw, moved into management, but also saw like the more people-centric side of management. I think I had that probably at Pulse and Google to some degree, but I wasn't, really paying attention to it because I wasn't in that role myself. But at Medium, I really felt like I moved more into finding what it meant for me to be a leader and how to motivate others as well without just like doing more work.
Yeah. So you said people-centric management there. How do you define that exactly?
I think a lot of times people think, we don't have time to care about what people want or support people. That's kind of a luxury for companies that have it more figured out. I think the opposite is true. Like even if you're in the middle of a release or even if you're a startup finding product market fit, if you can figure out what people want and then that can help you align, what the company wants with what people want, and that can actually help you help everyone move more quickly. But I don't see that happening a lot in the industry. And I feel like there's kind of like a dehumanizing aspect to that as well.
Yeah, definitely. So in Medium, you manage fairly large teams. I think I saw somewhere as many as 12 or 15. How many people were underneath you?
So we had an interesting structure. Sometimes I was running a product team with about 12 engineers, but I was managing maybe like 3/4 of them, but then also had like 4 or 5 other direct reports. So anywhere from like 12 to 15 direct reports.
So that's a lot. How were you able to, not just in terms of having regular one-on-ones with all these people, but making sure that you had the processes and structure in place so that all of those direct reports felt that they were getting the ample development that they needed in interfacing with their boss and all that stuff that's so important. But when you have a team of, say, 3 direct reports versus 9, time is a resource with limitations, right?
Yeah, it was really difficult. Like when I think the most I had was 15 direct reports. Wow. And it was definitely a challenge. People were on like every other week one-on-ones for 30 minutes, which I acknowledged was not enough. And I knew it wasn't enough, but we were hiring for another manager. And I think a lot of being a manager is just like kind of, I've heard the analogy of like plate spinning, in the circus, you have like the plate spinners. Yeah. It's like you just try to keep them up. And, sometimes you're like, I can't do it. Like, you take it. We're like, hire another plate spinner. But yeah, there's times when I was just super upfront with my manager and was like, hey, this team is my focus. And like, I'm doing the one-on-ones with these 4 people, but like, I'm not really, I'm not going to the meetings. And like, if something really dire happens, like, I'll let you know. But like, that's basically, I'm at capacity. And I think just being really upfront, managing up, making sure that was okay with my manager. Because maybe he would be like, oh, well, he was fine with it. He's like, yeah, I understand. Like, this is not sustainable and we're hiring. But, he could have said, oh, actually, this other team is more important, right? And so just having like really honest conversations with him.
Is there an ideal ratio of any kind, or is it too circumstantial to say?
Probably depends on the person. I mean, I can't imagine. 15 was really a lot.
Yeah.
I had a sweet spot of like, sort of had this idea that if I had like 6 to 8 people, then I could support them really well, but also have time and space to think about some larger strategic things. But I know like at Google or some other companies, sometimes people have like 30 or 40 direct reports, and like, that's not management.
Right.
That's something else, right? That's like having a reporting structure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
A lot is written about moving into management without, at least in terms of engineers, without losing your technical edge. Does that really matter in a position where your impact is no longer measured in code commits? Like, how important is it to stay on top of those things, or are you ultimately being distracted by trying to do that?
I think it depends on the person. I think there's this post recently about the like IC manager pendulum. And that's pretty common to do IC for a few years, do management for a few years.
That the best ICs
back.
were recently managers and the best managers were recently ICs.
Right. And that's a common career track. Not track. I've also heard it called like a jungle gym, because, life changes, people change, and you might want different things. And so I think there are people who know for sure they always want to keep one foot in the technical work. But I think what's important is to question why. So for me, I always, when I was moving more fully into management, I remember talking to my manager and I'm like, I sort of feel like maybe it'll be questioned. Like if I go anywhere else, people will not take me seriously technically. And I was very aware of like that possibility. And he prompted me to think about like, well, what would you get out of it? What are the skills or whatever that you would get out of going back and building more technical depth? And a lot of it was just like my inner critic of like, well, maybe people won't think I'm good enough. And so I think trying to figure out like, is it because you truly want it, or is it because you have self-doubt about, whether people will take you seriously or not, and the imposter syndrome?
Right. Yeah, that makes total sense.
Yeah. But there's not like a right or wrong, There's some people will always want to be coding at least part of the time.
Yeah, I think it's finding that balance, I think, is what's really important. So I know one thing that you're particularly passionate about that I think at least rose to more, not necessarily prominence, but I think was under a much bigger spotlight several years back when Google did their Project Aristotle. They found that the number one indicator of a successful team, more so than the skill levels of the ICs or anything like that, was a culture of psychological safety. I know that's something that's really important to you and that you've written quite a lot about. Just to set the groundwork for that topic, what does psychologically safe versus unsafe environment look like? What are the blockers that team members are running into, or questions they feel like they can't ask? Can you paint that picture for us?
Sure. So I think for me, a psychologically safe environment is one where people feel comfortable taking risks. They feel comfortable failing. They feel comfortable having really honest conversations and being a bit vulnerable with the people around them. So maybe that's, even if you're a leadership position, like opening yourself up, like having people see that you make mistakes and you're human. And that can really set the stage for what goes on like in the layers below, a leader. I think psychologically unsafe, sometimes it's not super obvious, but one of the things I've seen is like, people aren't taking initiative. That's pretty common, where it's like, people tend to say like, we need to hire more like mission aligned or like go-getters, and it's like, well, what about the people you hired?
Right. You hired them for a reason.
Right. And I think a lot of the times it's sort of people don't feel comfortable or safe stepping up and saying, hey, I have this idea, because maybe in the past they've been shut down or criticized without being recognized for stepping up. And then I think there's also like just the level of conversations people are having. If you find that like people are only talking about work, or people show up and they're always like, things are fine, and there's not really much depth to the conversation,
right,
that can also be an indicator of like not really psychologically safe.
So how do things tend to get this way? Because usually when it's only the first handful of people in a room, they're all questioning, breaking everything, and they have such great rapport. Is it a lack of onboarding for new people? It's I'm sure it's gradual, but how do things come so stale where people feel like they can't question the status quo in a working environment?
I think it's a bunch of factors. I mean, some of it is where people come from. So if people have come from a more toxic workplace, they may just assume that that's the way things are. Or maybe, you add in a layer of management and people suddenly assume, oh, those are the people who are making the decisions and now I just execute. And when those changes happen, not having those conversations around like what are expectations and what are the things you can bring to the table, I've seen that a lot.
So is that a really important thing then where, because I know as startups grow, hierarchy is one thing that ultimately has to be introduced. So being more proactive in terms of how an additional structure within the org is actually going to change or maybe not change the way people work.
Yeah, being super clear about what it means to have a layer of management, right? Because some people are used to management being like, well, this person is just going to decide what I do. Like every interaction with them is them like judging me and, jotting down notes for the next performance review.
Right. Are my goals green or orange or red?
Right. And I think a lot of people haven't experienced management as like, hey, I'm here to help you, the servant leadership aspect of it. And so being super clear and building that trust early on is really important because otherwise people just make assumptions about what their manager's there for.
Right. So for anyone in management that might be listening to this episode of the show, is there any types of, whether it's something formal like a questionnaire or an activity, or maybe just more informal questions they should be asking themselves to take stock of where their team is on this spectrum of psychological safety?
I know there's like a few different types of like surveys that you can do because sometimes people, like if it's really bad, people are not even going to feel safe.
Are these problems fixable? I mean, how do you course correct if things go south in this way?
I think it requires pretty upfront and honest conversations. I mean, I think it would be hard to admit that things are not going well. So there's a level of vulnerability in just saying like, hey, we took this survey and this does not look good. And like, let's figure out what to do with that. Right. But I think it really comes from leadership to set that example.
Is this something where more unconventional team building exercises, like say an offsite, could help play a role in terms of just having people break down barriers and be more comfortable building those relationships so that when they are in the workplace, then they can have those tougher conversations about, hey, maybe we need to see if the system's still the right solution that's been in place for so long, and being able to question those things.
Sure. Yeah. An offsite can be a great opportunity to kind of take a pause from whatever is the day-to-day and, depending on the offsite activities, but doing things that are more like trust building or talking about what's important to people. That could be a good way to kind of like jumpstart some trust building.
So one of the best things about being an engineer at a startup is the feedback loops. And when you're in the weeds as an IC, you're experiencing those all the time. And then when you move into a management role, a lot of those things you're working towards are you're in rooms having conversations about long-term, quarterly, annual company goals. How do you make sure you don't lose sight of the small successes that your team has and continue to celebrate those, as opposed to measuring everything to, all right, that's great, but how does it play into this overarching company goal that I'm now having to report on to my supervisors within the company? Yeah,
it's it can be difficult because the feedback loops are longer, and so sometimes you might think of like the team execution in a quarter. How motivated are people? How is the team executing this quarter? And that can be sort of long enough that if you make any changes, they can percolate a little bit. Some of them are just like, you might ask for feedback, but some of it you kind of have to like make up. Like, I remember this one time I had a direct report and he wasn't that happy about sort of the way projects were being assigned. Or it wasn't even projects, it was more like tasks. I don't remember what I asked him, but it was something around like, well, what do you think should happen? And he then emailed the tech lead and product manager, and they completely changed the way they were like, oh, you don't feel ownership? Like, let's change that. Let's give you more visibility into what the problems are and like what the projects are that come from the problems. And then, so you always have context on like, how does this contribute to our purpose as a team? And I felt really good about it because I'm like, well, I had that conversation, right? But no one else knew. So if I didn't really take credit for it just internally myself, like I don't think anyone would have really given me credit.
Recognize it.
Right. So you kind of have to like be a little bit selfish and make up some stories about, conversations you've had and the impact of them.
There are definitely times where it's okay to be selfish.
Yeah.
So I don't think we should discourage that.
Right.
So you have some pretty exciting news that just popped up, at least publicly, in your professional life. And that is that you are going to be partnering with Edmund Lau in the coming year, who's a fellow engineering leader, wrote The Effective Engineer, which is a book that we're a big fan of. We've had him on the podcast previously. And you're going to be doing a series of workshops and like all sorts of things. I'm not really exactly sure what, but if you can tell us about what some of those plans are and where we can learn more about them, that'd be really exciting.
Sure. So what we're out to do is to build the best leadership program for leaders in tech, starting with engineering leaders. So both of us have coached many engineering leaders, anywhere from like tech leads through VP Eng and CTOs. And so what we want to do is to take those learnings and put together workshops and frameworks and move on to online courses so that those frameworks are accessible to anyone, not just people who can have access to us as individual coaches. And so what we're going to start to do is to build workshops, and a lot of it will be around, having conversations as engineering leaders, really around the people-centric, like trust-building aspect of leadership. And then probably the middle of the year, we'll start to do some more online courses, and because it is very SF-centric right now, because that's where, we're both in the Bay Area. So we hope to move from more on-site workshops and going into companies and doing workshops to more online and global work.
That's awesome. So 5 years from now, if there was something that had changed that you could potentially draw back to you and Edmund's efforts, what change are you hoping to drive here?
So my dream is that everyone who works at a tech company will feel supported. They'll feel like their managers care about them as humans, and they will feel like connections with their manager and the people around them. I think that is something that is really lacking right now in the industry. There's so much focus on the shipping and the product, and we work with software, but we're humans.
Yeah.
So I want to bring that into the tech workplace and saturate the market with people-centric managers so that, when people are like, I don't feel that supported by my manager, all their friends are like, I feel super supported by my manager, and then if that manager will then get feedback and come to one of our courses or take our online course. And because right now I feel like if people have trouble with their manager, it's sort of tolerated. Like, oh, that's how it is everywhere.
Where am I going to go? That kind of thing. Right.
I mean, there's companies have different reputations for how supportive management is, but it's honestly few and far between. And the managers that are people-centric are few and far between as well.
So that hopefully product first doesn't mean people second.
Yeah, I think people first is also product first.
Yeah. And where can we go to either sign up to know when things are going to start rolling out or to learn more about this?
Coleadership.com, so coleadership.com.
Well, Jean, thank you so much for joining us on the show today. It's been a lot of fun.
Thanks.
I hope you enjoyed our chat with Jean Su. The new project with fellow engineering leader Edmund Lau that Jean mentioned has now been running for a few years. You'll find it at coleadership.com. That's it for this week. See you next Thursday for a brand new episode of Inside Intercom.
This is Inside Intercom.